very obviously. So it's great to be here in San Francisco again. As I said at the beginning, thanks so much for coming out. 4 o'clock on a Monday. We weren't really sure how many people would come. We had Dr. Frank here at the front, has run the Functional Forum meetup in San Francisco, had 89 people on the last one. So we thought, maybe we could take a chance and get a good crowd. But thanks so much for each of you. I know you've probably taken off time from work or family or everything to be here. And, we really, really appreciate you taking the time to come out and be here. So just a shout out to everyone who's watching at home. It wasn't meant to, for those of you who are watching in New York, it wasn't, just because we've left New York and I've left New York, I wasn't saying that, you're still in the prison, but, there's just, it kind of is a bit like that. When I went back recently, I was just like, it's so nice to go to New York as a visitor and not just as someone who lives there all the time. But yeah, California, thank you for embracing it. I live in California now and glad to be here, but we have so many meetups and it's so exciting. So last month we had our biggest ever functional forum in association with the IFM, and we had meetups in Dubai, in the Philippines, in Cape Town, in Havana. Who would like to come to a functional forum in Havana, Cuba? Anyone interested in that? Okay, so we're putting it all together. But yeah, literally there are meetups all over the country, all over the world. Thank you so much. Our intention is really to get practitioners together in a way that they can feel like they're being, they can really share the commonality of practicing in this type of way. And so it's very exciting to see this. And we're very excited talking about a new language, a language of the heart. We don't normally do the sponsor stuff at the beginning, but John and Carol are here from HeartMath. Where are they? Right down here at the front. Super excited to have HeartMath as part of the evolution. Let's have a round of applause for HeartMath. If you used it, you like it. Super great technology. Heart rate variability is something that a lot of practitioners are starting to use. We've had so many practitioners tell us that this is one of their favorite technologies. Our work here is to create convergence between technology and functional integrated medicine and plot a course for the new medicine, and we certainly feel like you guys are going to be part of that. So if you want to help the evolution of medicine at any time, you can go evomed.com/heartmath, check out what they're doing, either the classes or the events, and see and engage yourself with some of these brands. So, San Francisco has been a center for the future of medicine for a long time. This isn't the first iteration of a time where San Francisco has been at the forefront of the new medicine. So I just want to share a little video on what maybe the new medicine could have looked like about 50 years ago.
A medical dream comes true under the drive of industrialist Henry Kaiser, who holds the plans of the ultra-modern hospital designed by Dr. Sidney Garfield, director of the Kaiser Foundation. From the admissions office on, everything is streamlined and expedited. The patient's record reaches the doctor before he does. This is the last word in a combination X-ray machine and fluoroscope imported from Holland at a cost of $25,000. Every portion of the body through 180 degrees can be photographed. In the operating room, the first light of its kind is installed. No portion of an operation is ever in shadow. Nor is the expectant father forgotten. Here he can get the news officially and suffer under the most comfortable circumstances possible. And for mother, well, she has only to call for her baby, and baby comes sliding through a wall in a draw-like bassinet for a little visit with the new mother. In this $2 million institution, doors are opened by remote control, and on the single floor, patients are easily moved from place to place. Dream grounds for a dream hospital. The answer to a doctor's prayer.
All right, so that, one idea of the future of medicine, and this was, 60 years ago. But now we see in San Francisco together a new era, and it's typified by this word here, the convergence. And there's a grand convergence afoot in medicine. That video that you just saw, I first saw presented by Dr. Dan Kraft, who most of you know, or many of you know from Singularity University and Future Med. And this is a doctor with no training in functional medicine, no training in integrative medicine, but has come to the conclusion that what is necessary to deliver the type of exponential medicine that he talks about is P4 medicine. And that's, Lee Hood from Systems Biology, Institute of Systems Biology, is talking about P4 medicine. P4 medicine and functional medicine to me are completely interchangeable. All of the Ps are looking at the same, predictive, preventive, participatory. This is the same type of medicine that we're talking about. And there's a real convergence underway between not only the, that side of medicine, functional medicine, but we're also going to talk about evolutionary medicine. That's the name of today. We're talking about in integrative medicine, all coming together. And what I'm really excited to see is that the silos that have been there have been silos in medicine. There's been the cardiologists and endocrinologists and all these different groups that, those silos are starting to be broken down by things like functional medicine, where you sort of become a super generalist, right? But what is really exciting to see is that even the institutions are getting it. So we're very excited to announce that the August Functional Forum, we've got an epic lineup of functional forums coming up this year, but the August Functional Forum, we're going to be covering a conference in Stuttgart. And this is the first conference ever between the AIHM and the Institute for Functional Medicine and some of these other groups. This is not, this has been a convergence. Even the AIHM is a convergence between the American Holistic Medical Association. We've got the Roberts in the house. Welcome. Thank you guys for being here. And we also, and so, for the, and other groups. So you see a convergence. You see people realizing that we could do a lot more together than apart in these different silos. And if a part of integrative and functional medicine is getting rid of the silos clinically, we have to get rid of the silos organizationally as well. And our goal at the Functional Forum is to bring groups together, to bring groups all around the world. We have 200 meetup groups right now. We want it to get to 1,000 by the time we come live from the Cleveland Clinic on September the 12th. And our goal at the Cleveland Clinic, I saw Mark Hyman the other day and I said, Mark, all I want on that Cleveland Clinic thing is for Toby Cosgrove, the CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, to say, hey, we're betting on functional medicine for the future of chronic disease management. That's all he has to say. That guy goes to Davos. That guy has the attention and trust of the whole community. And I'm going to get him to say that on September 12th in Cleveland. And there's an opportunity for everyone who's listening to start your own meetup group, invite a bunch of doctors to come and hear it come from that source. This is a moment of credibility where we break into the mainstream, and we're very excited to be part of it. It's a grand convergence, and more than anything else, this is, Northern California is the site of that convergence. So I'm so thankful for you guys all to be here, and I'm thankful to have this topic at this time in this place. So we are going to get into some of the content here. We have a new podcast. I know some of you said on the way in that you love listening to the news. We do this thing called the Evolution of Medicine news video cast every week. And the last week of the month, we do a thing called Charting the Convergence with John Weeks. And John Weeks has been a campaigner for almost 40 years in this space, looking at the convergence between all of these different groups. And, check out the news, and I think you'll really enjoy what John has to say. So we're going to start the Functional Forum with someone that I have. We've got a couple of great speakers tonight. We've got an amazing panel. In fact, we've got a very exciting panel, so there'll be lots of time for questions. So if any questions come up, make sure you have them, and later on we'll have an opportunity for questions. I'm very excited to welcome, for his debut on the Functional Forum, a man that was the keynote at our Evolution of Medicine Summit last year, and is someone that I feel is going to play a significant role in bringing the principles of functional evolutionary medicine together and bringing it to more and more health professionals. So I'd love to have a warm round of applause to everyone for Chris Kresser.
Lav mic? Now it is. Take that away. So great to see so many friends and colleagues here. All right. Thanks so much for coming out, and thank you, James and Gabe and all the folks at the forum. I'm going to jump in because I have a lot I want to say in a pretty short period of time. And if you have questions, I think we'll be able to get to them after all the talks. So the central theme of the forum today and of the ancestral health and evolutionary medicine movements in general is that there's a profound mismatch between our genes and our biology on the one hand and the modern environment that we're living in on the other. For the most obvious example of this, and the one that we often talk about, is nutrition. So for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, humans ate primarily meat and fish, wild fruits and vegetables, some nuts and seeds, and some starchy plants. Now contrast that with today, when the top 6 foods in the American diet are grain-based desserts, bread, sugar-sweetened beverages, pizza, beer, and chicken, primarily fried chicken dishes like chicken nuggets. But I would argue that there is another example of mismatch that's not as frequently discussed, but is every bit as important, and that is our stress response system. So this has 2 primary components. There's the sympatho-adrenomedullary system, or the SAS, which is part of the sympathetic nervous system and is primarily responsible for our immediate or short-term stress response. And then there's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, which governs our intermediate or long-term stress response. Now these systems are both pretty complex, and we don't have time to go into detail on them today. But what I want you to keep in mind for the purposes of this talk is that mechanisms that are protective or adaptive in the short term can become damaging or maladaptive over the long term. For example, let's say you're a hunter-gatherer and you're out for a walk and you get confronted by a lion. In that case, it's a pretty good thing that your heart rate and blood sugar and blood pressure go up, your muscles tense, and your digestive and reproductive system shut down. All your body cares about in that moment is survival. It doesn't matter whether you digest your next meal or you're producing hormones that will lead to fertility. All it cares about is surviving that immediate threat. But what happens if this system is continually activated, as it often is in the modern world? We're stuck in traffic, we are using electronic media late at night, we're eating an inflammatory standard American diet, we're exposed to environmental toxins. All of these things activate that same stress response, but the difference is the changes that are protective and help us in the short term become damaging over the long term. This constant activation of the stress response erodes resilience and it depletes metabolic reserve. So resilience is defined as the immediate capacity of cells, tissues, and organ systems to respond to changes in physiological need. And metabolic reserve is the long-term capacity of the body to do that. I would argue that the loss of resilience and the depletion of metabolic reserve are key drivers of the modern disease epidemic. And this explains why stress is associated with such a dizzying array of conditions. And this is only a partial list here on this slide. So given this, it should be clear that addressing the stress response is absolutely crucial. It should be part of the treatment for every patient that walks through our door, no matter what their condition is. Now, so far in functional and integrative medicine, the model for approaching stress-related pathology has been based on the adrenal fatigue concept. And this, in turn, is somewhat loosely based on Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. And when Selye did research on animals, he observed a progression over time with the stress response. And then later, he didn't really study cortisol or pregnenolone or DHEA, but these hormones were kind of overlaid on his model. And it predicts levels of cortisol, as you see in the figure on this slide. In stage 1, cortisol goes up, pregnenolone and DHEA go down. Stage 2, cortisol begins to fall and can actually be in the normal range. But what differentiates stage 2 from a normal presentation would be the low levels of DHEA and pregnenolone. Stage 3, all 3 hormones continue to fall until they reach exhaustion or failure. Now, raise your hand if you're familiar with this model. Right. It's been the dominant paradigm of understanding stress-related pathophysiology in the functional and integrative medicine worlds for pretty much 3 decades now. But is it really an accurate representation of what happens? Is the adrenal fatigue concept in alignment with the current scientific evidence, and is it the model that will get us the best clinical results, which is perhaps the most important question? I'm going to argue that there are 3 primary problems with the adrenal fatigue concept. One is that many, if not most people with so-called adrenal fatigue don't actually have low cortisol levels. 2 is that even when cortisol is low, it's rarely because the adrenals are fatigued and unable to produce it. And 3 is that adrenal fatigue is not really supported by the current scientific understanding of the stress response. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, starting with number 1. So the assessment of adrenal fatigue has depended on saliva measurement of cortisol, primarily the adrenal stress index, measuring cortisol 4 times throughout the day. And cortisol that's measured in saliva is in the unbound or free fraction form. So it's not bound to a protein carrier. Now, this form of cortisol is the only form that has cell signaling effects, but it only represents about 3 to 5% of the cortisol in the body at any given time. The rest of the cortisol is cleared by several different metabolic pathways before it's conjugated and excreted in the urine. So while free cortisol certainly is the most potent form of cortisol, it's not the best marker for total cortisol production. Since the majority of cortisol is excreted in the urine as metabolites, measuring these metabolites is the best representation of cortisol secretion, as this study concluded. The sum of total cortisol metabolites provides a reflection of cortisol secretion rate. Now, this might be a moot point if free cortisol and total or metabolized cortisol were always the same. The problem is they're not, and in fact, they're often discordant. It's possible, for example, to have low free cortisol and have normal or even high total cortisol. And in fact, this happens in several different conditions, like obesity and insulin resistance. So now 38% of the US population is obese, 2/3 are overweight, so these are obviously very common conditions. Active stress response, also quite common in the industrialized world, hyperthyroidism, glucocorticoid use, and chronic fatigue syndrome. As a side note, it's also possible to have high free cortisol and low total cortisol, and this happens in conditions like hypothyroidism and impaired liver function. But we're not going to go into that in this presentation. Now, in obesity, you would expect to see normal or low free cortisol and then high cortisol metabolites. The figures on the slide here are from a study published in Obesity, and it looked at the relationship between urine and saliva free cortisol and cortisol metabolites and then obesity. And what they found, as you can see in the charts, is that there was no difference in free cortisol levels between obese patients and controls. But when they looked at cortisol metabolites, there was a linear increase in total cortisol as fat mass increased. So check out this test result. This is from a lab called Precision Analytical that offers a dried urine hormone test, the Dutch test. And as you can see here, this patient has very low free cortisone, very low free cortisol, and a flattened diurnal cortisone and cortisol rhythm. Now, these aren't at the levels that you'd expect to see in something like Addison's or true adrenal insufficiency, but they are in the realm of what might be typically called stage 3 adrenal fatigue if we're using that model. If you did a saliva adrenal stress index on this patient, you might expect to see something like this: low cortisol in the morning and all throughout the day, and then a low total 24-hour sum cortisol estimate. But check out the cortisol metabolites in this patient. They are close to 9,000, which is over 2 times the upper end of the reference range, and the total DHEA production is almost 5,300, which is also more than 2 times the upper end of the reference range. So this patient was 420 pounds with significant insulin resistance and leptin resistance. So this is obesity. This is not adrenal fatigue. And the best way to treat this patient and to bring the cortisol levels down may not be to use things to reduce cortisol. It may be to address their blood sugar and insulin and leptin regulation. So this is, we're going to talk more about why this is so important later. What about chronic fatigue syndrome? At first glance, it does appear that studies support the idea that chronic fatigue patients have low cortisol. For example, this study found that average cortisol and cortisone concentrations were significantly lower in patients than in controls across the whole day. So if we stop there, we would think, yes, this supports the idea that chronic fatigue patients have low cortisol. But that study only measured free cortisol. And the same authors, interestingly enough, did a study later where they measured both free cortisol and free cortisone in the urine. And as was consistent with the previous study, they found that there were lower levels of free cortisol and free cortisone in chronic fatigue patients than in controls. But look what happened when they measured cortisol metabolites in the urine. There was absolutely no difference at all between urinary cortisol metabolites between controls and patients. So they had the same total cortisol output. Now, lest you think it's uncommon to see these kinds of disparities in free cortisol and total cortisol, according to unpublished data from Precision Analytical, the lab we just talked about a couple slides back, looking at 2,000 test subjects, of those who had low free cortisol, only 15% actually had low total cortisol. The other 85% had either high normal, or low normal total cortisol. So if you put this a different way, a patient that has low free cortisol in the urine or in the saliva is actually more likely to have normal or high total cortisol. So let's move on to number 2. Even when cortisol is low, it's rarely because the adrenals are fatigued and unable to produce it. The control mechanisms for cortisol production in the adrenal glands reside primarily in the brain and the central nervous system. The HPA axis governs circadian and stress signals in the brain and cortisol output through negative feedback inhibition. So even though the adrenals are what produce cortisol, the regulatory mechanisms are primarily outside of the adrenal glands. And while the production of cortisol by the adrenal glands is important, it's really only the tip of the iceberg. Cortisol is such a potent hormone. The body has multiple regulatory mechanisms for controlling its bioavailability in local tissues. And this turns out to be the most important factor determining how cortisol affects our physiology. So, for example, if we're producing huge amounts of cortisol, but our cells are resistant to it, then we're not going to experience a hypercortisolemic state. It's not going to have that effect on us. So we don't have time to cover all of the brain and central nervous system and tissue-specific regulatory mechanisms tonight, but I do want to cover 3 of them. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I recommend a book by Dr. Tom Williams called The Role of Stress in the HPA Axis in Chronic Disease Management. He covers these mechanisms in detail and several others. I do want to cover 3 of them, though, just to give you an idea of how this works. Oops. Okay, so the first is downregulation of the HPA axis. And what happens here is when we're exposed to stress for a prolonged period of time, or really intense stress, like with PTSD, you see a downregulation in CRH receptor sensitivity. And this is the body's wise attempt to protect itself from the effects of chronically high cortisol levels. But the problem is that that actually ends up reducing the body's ability to produce cortisol, which is an important hormone, of course, in the face of future stress. So this is a perfect example of a change that is adaptive or protective in the short term that becomes maladaptive over the long term. The second mechanism is impaired cortisol signaling. Chronically high cortisol levels will lead to cortisol resistance in a similar way that chronically high insulin levels lead to insulin resistance. And this can be caused by a decrease in cortisol receptor sensitivity and or a decrease in cortisol receptor expression. The third mechanism is decreased cortisol bioavailability at the tissue level. And this can have several different causes. One is increased levels of the binding protein that carries cortisol through the blood. Most of it is cortisol binding globulin. It's also albumin carries a little bit of cortisol. 2 is increase in the conversion of cortisol, which is the more active form of the hormone, into cortisone, which is the less active form. And 3 is the activation of the multi-drug resistant pump. So this pumps cortisol outside of the cell where it can't have its transcriptional effects. Finding number 3, adrenal fatigue as a concept isn't really supported by current scientific understanding of the stress response. If we want to maintain credibility and increase the acceptance of functional medicine, as James was talking about in his intro, I think we need to align our diagnostic and therapeutic models with scientific evidence as much as possible. And if you look in the scientific literature for adrenal fatigue as a term, as of a couple days ago, there were 10 results. And they weren't the highest quality results either. But if your patients go searching for adrenal fatigue on the web, they might come across the Endocrine Society fact sheet that says adrenal fatigue is not a real medical condition. And there are no scientific facts to support the theory that long-term mental, emotional, or physical stress drains the adrenal glands and causes many common symptoms. Now, I think this is poorly worded because it almost sounds like they're saying there are no facts to support the idea that stress causes common symptoms, which is absolutely crazy. But I think what they mean to say is there's no evidence to support the idea that those symptoms are caused by drained adrenal glands, and I would absolutely agree with that. On the other hand, there are literally thousands of studies, in fact, 18,320 the last time I checked, looking at the effects of stress on human physiology via dysregulation of the HPA axis and the SAS. But in these cases, it's usually high cortisol or a disrupted cortisol diurnal rhythm or cortisol resistance or any of these other mechanisms that we've been talking about that is the problem rather than low cortisol. And even when cortisol is low, it's because of the brain or central nervous system or tissue-specific mechanisms, not because the adrenals are tired or can't produce it anymore. Now, there are some known conditions like Addison's disease or glucocorticoid-induced adrenal insufficiency that present with really low cortisol levels, but these are pretty rare. Addison's affects fewer than 200,000 people a year in the US, and the levels of cortisol that are observed in Addison's or true adrenal insufficiency are orders of magnitude lower than what are observed in so-called adrenal fatigue. So if it's not adrenal fatigue, what are we going to call it? This is not a particularly elegant term, but I would argue that HPA axis dysregulation is more accurate. And in fact, HPA axis maladaptation is probably the most accurate term because as we've discussed, the changes that occur in the syndrome that we're talking about are an attempt of the body to protect itself. It's actually the body doing something smart to protect itself against the effects of chronically high cortisol levels, but those changes end up being maladaptive in the long term. Another option, though, would be to just name the specific dysfunction that we see. So if the patient actually has high cortisol, we would call it hypercortisolism. If they really do have low cortisol, we would call it hypocortisolism, which just names that it's low, but doesn't imply that it's low because of poor adrenal function. Or we would call it disrupted diurnal cortisol rhythm or cortisol resistance or whatever it is. So why does this matter so much? First, it brings us into alignment with the current scientific evidence base, and this allows us to leverage the vast amount of research that connects stress and HPA axis function and disease. And there's so much fascinating work being done on this. For us to be able to plug into that and converse with other clinicians who are working in that field, I think is really important. Second is that it helps clinicians and patients to better understand what's happening. So if we have this idea that the symptoms are all caused by the adrenals being tired and unable to produce cortisol, there are very few clinical interventions that we have available to us. We don't know much about how to increase cortisol output by the adrenals. And we can, of course, replace cortisol with Cortef and things like that, but it's a pretty limited frame. But if we understand that this is a complex syndrome involving dysregulation of the HPA axis and the SAS and tissue-specific regulatory mechanisms, and it's caused by things like circadian disruption and glycemic dysregulation and inflammation, in addition to the common mechanisms that we talk about, that will lead to a much broader range of treatment options and diagnostic options for that matter. Number three is that related to two, it leads to better treatment outcomes and prevents harm. So if we see a patient that has low free cortisol and we prescribe something that will increase cortisol levels, and then we find that that patient actually had high total cortisol, there is potential for causing harm. So I think the term adrenal fatigue has served a really useful purpose when we lacked a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the HPA axis and stress-related pathology. And there's no doubt that interventions that have been prescribed in this model have helped thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and continue to help people today. But I would argue that as our knowledge has progressed, this oversimplified explanation has become an impediment to making more progress. And an analogy here would be good and bad cholesterol. which was a simple heuristic that was created to raise awareness about the relationship between diet and heart disease. But now as our understanding has grown about the roles of LDL and HDL, it turns out to be a lot more complex than this originally led on, and this oversimplification, I think, holds us back. So I would argue it's time to lay the adrenal fatigue concept to rest. As Max Planck famously said, one of my favorite quotes, science progresses one funeral at a time. So if we want to move forward, we have to be willing to continually challenge our beliefs and let go of them when the evidence doesn't support them. I hope I've showed that to be the case here with the adrenal fatigue concept. So if you're interested in this topic, I'll be covering it in more detail later in a free seminar. I also have a free seminar coming up this spring on myths and truths about SIBO, diagnosis and treatment, which is SIBO is all the rage now. And I've put together a special offer for all you functional forum folks with training on how to approach 10 of the most common health conditions that we treat in our practice, from hypothyroidism to autoimmune disease to overweight, from a functional and ancestral perspective, with diet, lifestyle, supplement recommendations, lab ideas for labs, as well as discounts and free passes for upcoming seminars. So you can check that out at goevomed.com/Kresser. Thank you all for listening, for your time.
So when Chris was talking about the different options that he was going to speak about, I asked him to speak about that because I think it fits well into the framework of what we were talking about before. But also it's a little controversial, and maybe people will tune in because adrenal fatigue is something you definitely hear talked about a lot in these circles. And I really agree with Chris. It's like, if we want to have mainstream acceptance, we need to talk in the right language, right? There's one thing Gabe and I always talk about in the news, is that we all need to start speaking the same language, in medicine if we're going to have this real convergence. And while we've had our own weird language in this space, it hasn't endeared ourselves, especially when new doctors come in and they're like, oh, what's this world all about? And they hear terms that either they don't agree with or that they can Google. And the Endocrine Society, has that paper there. The Endocrine Society did last year, come out and say, look, environmental toxins are having a real effect on the endocrine system. So, this is not our enemy. This is just people that need education and support, and that's the kind of structure that we can provide here. So thanks so much for Chris. Yeah, go to goevomed.com/Kresser. There's tons of awesome resources there. There's going to be some great webinars this summer. And thanks so much, Chris, for setting such a good foundation. So we've had some awesome questions and interactions so far from Twitter. Everyone watching at home, thanks so much. Vancouver, BC is in the house. Dr. Ellie Campbell's group down at the Amen Clinic in Atlanta is always consistent. I want to shout out to both of them. But what's really exciting is that New York is blowing up. Since we moved and we moved out and now we're moving across the country and across the world, I'm really excited to announce that we have the team in Manhattan. So excited to see the team at Kima. Thanks so much for continuing the community there. But we also have Long Island and Westchester and New Jersey. So exactly what I hope would happen is that people want to get together in their local communities, meet other practitioners and learn together in community. And I'm thrilled to see that happening. So we are talking about different ways that we're going to have to adapt in order for functional medicine to become the standard of care. And one of those is clinically, and I think Chris has laid out a great framework for us to do that. But the other thing is practice efficiency, because one thing that is becoming more and more clear is that if functional medicine needs to be the standard of care, doctors need to make the right amount of money doing it, and they need to be efficient in their practice. And so one of the things that we do here at the Evolution of Medicine is to connect practitioners to technologies that can make the practice of functional medicine that much more effective. And so, one of the things we reach out to people like Chris. Chris had 5 EHRs before he found the one that was any good. So rather than you all having to go through the pain of that, we just say, hey, Chris, what's the best one? He tells us, we hear it from everyone else, and then we communicate that to the community. So what we have here is technology sponsors that really help to improve the efficiency of functional medicine, because if we have to see everyone an hour and a half at a time, there's not going to be enough doctor hours to go around, right? So A big shout out to IGBO. You're going to be hearing from Dr. Shiv Kapadia later. He's the Chief Medical Officer of IGBO. IGBO is the Uber for phlebotomists. And so there are a couple of Iggies in the house right here. Give us a wave. So, phlebotomists who will go to your patient's office, your patient's home, and do the blood test. We're going to be having a dinner tonight where we're going to look at different panels that are available. You don't have to have a phlebotomist in your office. You don't actually have to do the phlebotomy. These guys will, will do it for you. So most of you have an information packet on your chairs. If you're watching at home, it's a very exciting time with IGBO. People ask me, where can I get an Iggy? If you watched last week, you know that my wife was stuck in Sacramento last week. So the easy way to think about it is basically anywhere that's got an NFL team or an NBA team has one. So you can see Sacramento's about here. This is a bit random that they've got a whole slot here. I don't know what this is, but good. I'm glad that they've got that. You've got Vegas right here. Vegas is here. So these are all the places where you can do it. This is probably like 80% of the whole population in all of these centers here. And this is growing. This map is growing out. So in all of these areas, you can have a much more efficient way of dealing with the labs that aren't Quest and LabCorp. If you're doing specialty labs, so much easier now. And we're going to continue to develop with them. Anne and Shave down here, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate IGBO. When people ask me, oh yeah, I was speaking with Dr. Ornish yesterday. I was interviewing him and I was telling him about what we do. And he asked me, what are the types of sponsors that you have? Because people are always wary of the sponsor section. There's the advertising section. And every time I talk about IGBO and everyone's like, yeah, that sounds amazing. We should definitely do that. So thanks so much for them. And look, locally, they got you covered. So there's one lady here who flew from New York. Where is she? Yes. Yes, over there. Thank you. So that's the record. Last month it was the record, Boulder to New York. This is even further. So, if most of everyone else here is from the area, a couple from Portland, the crew here in the front, Andrea and Jolene. But yeah, anywhere here, if you're using advanced labs, check out goevomed.com/IGBO, get signed up. And if you use specialty labs, just make it super easy for your patient to be compliant. When we interviewed Dr. Kapadia on our podcast, he told us that typically about 60% of people will take your recommendation for a specialty lab, will actually follow through. If that's not good enough and you prefer 98%, then use IGBO. This is an exciting announcement for everyone who's been watching, but HealthWave has changed their name and they're now called FullScript. So we've been recommending HealthWave for a long time. It's a best-in-category e-prescribe tool. Again, I see so many practitioners who start their practice, they go to a conference, they get wowed by the room with all the supplements, they spend all this money on having a big supplement store, and they don't have enough money to market to get patients into their practice. And FullScript, shifting from HealthWave to FullScript, they now have every supplement company in there. They're completely agnostic. So the supplement companies that we all know that aren't available on Emerson Ecologics are now available on FullScript. And you can integrate your online and offline inventory, which is super cool. So you have a point of sale system in the clinic, and then if people need to refill, they can do it on the online platform, and it's all completely seamless. Again, efficiency. I worked in a clinic for 1.5 years, and going into the back room to get the right supplements and ship it all off was a complete nightmare. I'm sure that's going on in most of your practices because I've been to thousands of them and I know. So FullScript is a really efficient way. It's a great user experience. Freedom Practice Coaching has been a supporter for a long time. We're really excited. We just spoke to another doctor to find out about their work. So Freedom Practice Coaching is a full immersion company where you learn essentially their system. So, we hear from doctors all the time that their careers go something like this. They come out of fee-for-service regular medicine, they go into fee-for-service functional medicine, and very quickly completely run out of time. Right? And they get so busy, and they're busy, and maybe they do good marketing, they do good work, but they're so busy, but they're still not happy because they're just way too busy and they're not, living the kind of lifestyle that they recommend to patients, stress-free, HPA dysregulated, right? They're HPA completely dysregulated. And so we need to have a system, a practice system, to be able to replicate the structure that, is efficient. And so one of the reasons why we love FPC is they teach you how to make packages that are more in line with what's going to be needed for chronic disease. You're not going to treat obesity or type 2 diabetes in one appointment. So why do you have a fee-for-service system? You need to have a system that's more, that reflects the kind of care interaction you're going to have. That's why we recommend things like direct primary care, and we're going to have some exciting things about that coming up soon. But FPC, up until now, the only way that you could interact with them is to go through their whole 3-year coaching program. And for a lot of people, that wasn't a fit. I'm really excited to announce today, if you go to goevomed.com/FPC, they now have weekend seminars where you can go and learn the system of creating the packages, doing the group education, all the things that are necessary to scale your impact using nutritionists and doctors together in a synergistic team. I know there's a lot of people at home that are interested in that. Nutritionists need doctors, and doctors need nutritionists, and all the other providers too. And the Functional Forum meetups groups are the places where these people can connect and collide. And so check out FPC. They're doing some great work, and now it's more available for more people to go and check out their system than before. And then Embody 360, so these guys debuted at the Integrated Health Symposium. Again, talk about efficiency. Gone are the days of the food diary, right? The food diary, what a great thing to have patients to do, to really think about what they're doing and write everything down. But one, they always forget to do it after the second day, and you don't know that they forgot to do it until day 30, until they actually come into you and they go, oh yeah, I forgot to do the food diary. But the problem is, they might just quit their appointment and not come because they feel so guilty that they didn't follow through. Now with something like Embody 360, it's an app that's on their phone, and they do their food diary into the phone, and you can see whether they're doing thing or not. And I was using it, something like this, and I was going through, and obviously I forgot after the first day to do it, because everyone does. And on the second day, they said, oh, you haven't eaten anything yet, James? And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot. So now there was that dynamic communication. And so again, even more reason to have a health coach and a doctor working together, because the health coach or the nutritionist can be on that, can be on them. That's the real connection between doctor and patient that's not possible in the pre-digital age. Talk about practice efficiency. This is the efficiency that needs to happen for root cause resolution medicine to hit the mainstream. And we're super excited to have these technologies as our sponsors, because hopefully the sponsor bit of the show doesn't feel so sponsory, because this is really important. This is where the rubber hits the road in making functional integrative medicine accessible to doctors and getting them to use it. So we're very excited for all of these sponsors, and thanks so much for their support. So keep the questions coming in on Twitter. One of the things that I love to do, we did a podcast series last month called Leaders of the New School, really looking at doctors that are bringing, strong female doctors bringing strong feminine qualities to medicine. If you watched the Functional Forum last month, you would have seen Jeff Bland and Kelly Brogan going at it and talking about, what is intuition, systems thinking, and, how feminine qualities coming into medicine are going to be the solution for chronic disease. And we had Dr. Stephanie Daniel on there. One of my favorite things to do is sort of like unearth new talent for the functional medicine community, because if you go to the conferences, sometimes you feel like the lineups can be a little bit stale, right? So you need a bit of fresh blood in there. And so it's a great pleasure for me to welcome for our first time on the Functional Forum, a warm hand for Dr. Stephanie Daniel.
Hi, everybody. Just give me one moment. Is this working? Can you guys hear me? Presentation mode. I just asked Kenny where my notes were, but I don't see them anywhere.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I can get another computer with it on.
Yeah. Sorry, I was like, just unplugged.
I don't unplug it.
It's ready to go. Oops. There you go. Yeah, it's not on here.
You get it?
How do I just undo? There we go. There you go. Got it? But I'm in. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, James, for the great intro, and thank you, Chris, for that great, alternative perspective on adrenal function. Now we're going to go into a macro level view of the evolutionary origins of thyroid disease. Who here has heard the phrase, the canary in the coal mine? Okay, good, most of you. For those of you who haven't heard, the canary in the coal mine is the analogy that refers to an early warning of impending danger and originates back to the early part of the 20th century when miners used to bring caged canaries with them to work. When the canaries keeled over from excessive exposure of toxic gases like carbon monoxide, the miners knew they needed to exit immediately to escape the same impending danger as the levels of gas were rising. Before we can understand how and why the thyroid serves as an alarm signal to us, much like the canaries did to the coal miners, we have to understand the evolutionary origins of the thyroid and thyroid hormone. But why this? Why is this of interest to me? In my early 20s, I was recruited into the finance world as a research assistant to some of the biggest medical minds in the country, whose job it was to decide which medical investments would help change the world and also yield the highest returns. I had the privilege of working alongside these brilliant doctors at a very young age in the heart of Silicon Valley who were asking some of the most fundamental questions about health within the context of evolutionary medicine. The answers to those questions were formulated into medical journal articles, patents of intellectual property, and investment theories. While we never invested in thyroids or canaries, this experience significantly influenced the framework in which I practice functional medicine today. It was at the intersection of evolutionary theory, medicine, and investing that I learned a key concept: the emergence of disease as a result of the maladaptive response by our biology to our modern day environment and lifestyle, or as Chris was noting, the mismatch. This is our modern day lifestyle, hallmarked by being sedentary, working 12+ hour days, staring at screens with overexposure to artificial light and consumption of artificial foods. Much like these characters in their moving seats going to and from nowhere, like in the sci-fi movie WALL-E. This modern day lifestyle is the antithesis of the presence and interaction with our natural world that was necessitated by our evolutionary origins. It was during this time that life demanded us to sprint and to rest, to experience hot and cold, to follow cycles of light and dark, feast and famine. Who could use more of this in their life? Today, though our biology has changed very little over time, we spend much of our day cut off from the natural world, rarely afforded the opportunity to follow the rhythms of our environment or to exercise the dynamic range that allows for robust levels of homeostatic capacity, our inherent ability to self-stabilize in response to external and internal stimuli. Since the beginning of mankind, 200,000 years ago, during the Pleistocene era, when Homo sapiens first made their appearance, we are essentially the same biologically and genetically today as we were then. The framework of disease as a maladaptation of our prehistoric biology to our modern day lifestyle informs the perspective through which I view my patients' symptoms, including how to assess and treat thyroid disease. So armed with that perspective and emerging from one of our discussions, I helped publish a theory with my colleagues about the evolutionary origins of the incorporation of iodine into thyroid hormone. Has anyone ever wondered why the thyroid uses iodine? Okay, maybe not. We hypothesized that incorporation of iodine into the structure of thyroid hormone emerged from its role as a prehistoric signal of ecologic opportunity. What does the body need to function, and what does iodine have to do with it? The hypothesis and the evidence for it go like this. Higher energy environments, or environments with resource abundance, promote a more aggressive life history plasticity. Life history strategy refers to a theory of biological evolution that seeks to explain aspects of an organism's anatomy and behavior by reference to the way their life histories have been shaped by natural selection. In other words, an organism's reproductive development and behaviors, such as when it reaches sexual maturity, how early it is first able to reproduce, the number of offspring it has, how little or how much parental involvement there is, and the length of its lifespan, all dependent on the physical and ecological environment of the organism. In these abundant environments, when there was plenty of food, a species could skew its life history to faster growth, larger adult size, greater genetic variation, shorter lifespans, larger brood sizes, and offspring ratio skewed toward the larger size gender. The implication being that this high energy environment presented the perfect opportunity in which to perpetuate the species. Having more offspring early in life meant many opportunities to have some survive into adulthood in order to reproduce again. This was considered winning in evolution. By contrast, lower energy environments that were more barren and sparse in resources skewed to the opposite. Slower growth, smaller adult size, less variation, smaller brood size, and an offspring ratio skewed towards the smaller size gender, which in humans is females. Now, I'm not saying men are any better. It just takes more resources for us as a species to take a chance on creating them. To give a modern day example of how life strategy expresses itself, we need only to look at changes in sex ratio. Remember that the high energy abundant environments have an offspring ratio skewed to the larger size gender, and the sparse lower energy environments to the smaller size gender, or in the case of humans, ratio of male to female. Study after study show examples where resource availability influences the ratio of having male babies to female babies. The more abundant resource supply, the higher the chance you'll get a boy, indicating the body's ability to distinguish social and environmental cues of resource abundance. For example, data pulled from over 86,000 surveys showed that respondents living with a spouse or a partner had a statistically significant 51.5% sex ratio skewed to male, versus only 49.9% in respondents who were not partnered, independent of other factors such as economic status, parental age, or paternal bias against daughters. If we equate the abundant environment with a two-parent household and the more scarce environment with a single-parent household, you can see the way this plays out. More boys were born to the former and more girls to the latter. Numerous examples of this have been shown in the literature where following war or natural disasters, the sex ratio skews to fewer male offspring than female, when the opposite is true during times when things are going well. We may be able to conclude that this response is potentially a signal of resource scarcity that results from a war-torn country, or in a war-torn country. This determination may occur through analysis of bottom-up data, such as caloric intake, or top-down data, such as ambient temperature. Integration of various sources of data then allows for the development of fitness strategies tailored to life history. For example, caloric restriction slows metabolism and extends lifespan. A 2008 study published in the journal Thyroid showed that an extended fasting state induced significant changes in the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, with a downregulation of thyrotropin-releasing hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, and T3 and T4, which the study concluded likely represented an energy-saving mechanism which could be vital to survival during times of food shortage. Another study published in Frontiers in Zoology just a couple of months ago proved that environmental cues such as ambient temperature drop induced suppression of metabolism in brown bears as they entered into a state of hibernation. Numerous studies have shown that circulating levels of thyroid hormone are reduced in hibernating animals. Reduced temperature and restricted resources are variables that influence our energy-regulating gatekeeper, the thyroid. It is in this response to environmental signals that the thyroid can protect us like the canary did the coal miners. So how did a reduction in caloric intake or the onset of winter when it's cold and few things grow well become coupled with a downregulation of thyroid hormone activity? The answer may lie in the evolution of how thyroid hormone production became dependent on the availability of iodine. When the earth was covered largely in water and there were primordial organisms that started their life in the sea, resource abundance meant thick, flourishing beds of sea kelp. To these organisms, which used consumption as their primary means to sample their environment, thereby acquiring information, thick kelp forests conferred the presence of higher energy environments. More kelp meant more food. A more nutrient-rich sea salad bar meant this was a better environment in which to have many large broods. It's been theorized that kelp and other marine algae, which emerged into existence some 20 million years ago, long before us, formed the basis of our food chain. Kelps are one of the many types of algae that populate the ocean surface and are one of the richest sources of iodine in biology. Kelps are characterized by variable life cycles, one of which accumulates iodine at 30,000 times its concentration in the ocean and up to 1% of its dry weight. 1% may not sound like much, but we're talking about a single element. Evidence suggests that iodine was concentrated in kelps for its antimicrobial and antioxidant properties, similar to how we use iodine in the antiseptic betadine. It was in the emergence of kelp as the basis of our food chain that we hypothesized iodine may have represented a reliable proxy of ecologic potential, as thicker kelp forests meant more resource abundance. In times of abundance, a species could take more risks. Measurements of iodine by each species up the food chain could serve as a far more effective signal detection mechanism than pure measurement of caloric intake, since not all calories are created equal in terms of their nutrient density. With each successive member of the food chain, the incorporation of a basic element like iodine obviates the likelihood that it was involved in the signaling, as it could be potentially modulated based on how each member of the food chain put it to use. We believe that it was the concentration of iodine in the kelp forests of our prehistoric ecosystems that led to its emergence as a substrate for the production of thyroid hormone, which we all know is made up of a tyrosine molecule surrounded by molecules of iodine. T4 and T3 hormones produced by the thyroid gland and utilized by every cell in the body regulates the proper function of cells, modulating growth, reproduction, metabolic rate, and lifespan, all features of the life history strategy. Much like the abundance of thick kelp forests meant plentiful resource availability, normal levels of circulating thyroid hormones signal to us for healthy rates of metabolism, helping us to maintain body temperature, regulating our growth and development, and influencing the rate of function of each cell. Further evidence of this can be seen in the response of thyroid hormones to direct cues of energy availability. For example, in starvation, low levels of glucose and insulin are associated with low thyroid function. And as we heard before, metabolic rates decline, and thyroid T3 and T4 levels are lower in calorie-restricted animals like the hibernating bears. Additionally, low thyroid hormone levels are independently associated with smaller adult stature, reduced growth hormone, slowed metabolism, and decreased fertility. Does anybody remember this picture from med school? Familiar? It's not just in humans that we see this relationship, but in many lower species as well. Among species of salmon, for example, we have evidence that thyroid hormone plays a role in determining the timing of developmental metamorphoses. T4 levels appear to regulate the smoltification changes that precede the migration of salmon from freshwater to saltwater, a process that requires a tremendous amount of energy by the fish, as they have to adapt physiologically in order to live in saltwater from having been freshwater dwellers. Also, exogenous administration of L-thyroxine, or T4, to salmon shortens the intervals between broods and accelerates egg development in the next batch, consistent with the hyperthyroid states it induces. When thyroid hormone production declines in humans, all body systems, as well as overall health, are affected in a number of ways. The effect of hypothyroidism on the brain function can lead to memory issues, depression, and brain fog. The cardiac system experiences a decrease in heart rate and cardiac output. Fluid retention and puffiness result from kidney dysfunction. In the liver, we see elevations in lipid production, digestion slows down, and the effect on the reproductive system causes menstrual abnormalities and infertility. Everything in the body slows down. Every aspect of the biological system looks to the thyroid for its cue of safety. Is it okay to go about business as usual, or do we need to downregulate all functions in order to survive? It truly is the canary. The results of this decrease in cellular metabolic rate contribute to the common symptoms we know of hypothyroidism, like fatigue, weight gain, cold intolerance, constipation, trouble conceiving, hair loss, and so on. Whereas these symptoms may be interpreted as the crux of the problem by many, the wider lens of evolutionary origin tells us that, in fact, the decrease in thyroid function, along with the symptoms that accompany it, may instead be acting as a signal for alarm of impending danger, much like the canary's signal to the miners. By doing so, it allows us to adapt our life history strategies accordingly. In other words, hypothyroidism could be seen as an adaptive response. Much like the disappearing kelp forests were a signal of scarcity, the body's interpretation of declining thyroid hormone is also of resource scarcity, or the proverbial equivalent of proceed with caution. In response, our overall energy usage and expenditure decreases in order to ensure our survival. This would not be the time to start that new job, run a marathon, or have a baby. Here's the cheat sheet courtesy of the IFM. A sick thyroid may be an indication of many root cause factors, representative of scarcity or low energy in our environments. It may be signifying a lack of adequate nutrients needed for thyroid hormone production. It may be a sign that stress, infection, or toxins are present when internal resources would best be conserved in order to manage the inciting offenders. It may be signifying the presence of autoimmunity triggered by dysbiotic flora in the gut. Whatever the case may be, a decline in thyroid function would be seen as the alarm bell meant to signify it's time to turn inward, hibernate, take fewer risks, and wait out the proverbial famine. In other words, it's a sign for us as clinicians to look beyond the hormone dysregulation, identify the root cause, and intervene accordingly. So a case example adapted from my practice. Natalie had struggled with infertility for years. She was 33 years old. The standard workup revealed no real reasons for why she and her partner weren't able to conceive. After all, menstrual cycles were regular. Her reproductive organs were healthy, her hormones were normal, and sperm quality and count were near perfect. Thyroid-stimulating hormone was clearly in range by conventional standards. With more testing, we found the following. In terms of optimization for fertility, TSH was borderline at best. T4 was okay, as it was close to mid-range. T3 levels were borderline low, and reverse T3 was quite high. It appeared from this that she was functionally hypothyroid, largely due to inflammation, as noted by her C-reactive protein and TPO elevations. Further investigation determined she had a gut dysbiosis due to candida, which likely resulted in increased intestinal permeability. Her leaky gut allowed gliadine antigens from her favorite pasta meals into her bloodstream, which triggered her immune response marked by inflammation and elevated thyroid antibodies. A gluten-free diet, treatment with antifungal agents, probiotics and digestive enzymes, as well as efforts to repair the intestinal barrier, resulted in a dramatic drop of inflammation and thyroid antibodies. With the addition of key nutrients that had also been missing, like iron and vitamin D3, Natalie's thyroid function improved, returning to near optimal levels. A month after that, she was pregnant. What is the takeaway here? How can we offer the most benefit to our patients? If we think about thyroid dysfunction as an evolutionary adaptive response, it can help guide the discovery process of underlying root cause. The decline in thyroid function may be a protective mechanism meant to ensure our survival when the external environment or internal biological ecosystem is not otherwise safe and abundant for us to continue functioning normally. What benefit would there have been if the coal miners had put an oxygen mask on the canary at the first sign of distress? Rather than seeing thyroid dysfunction as the core problem that in itself needs fixing, think of it as the canary doing its job to warn of impending danger. Then get to work assessing potential root cause variables such as toxin exposure, nutrient status, hidden infections, and gut dysbiosis. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll bring back up to the panel in a minute. Thanks so much, Steph, for delivering that. We like to keep it a little bit practical and a little bit meta at the same time, just to keep you guys interested. But, you know, I have to say, you know, if you take that back to the very first thing that you saw tonight of, you know, the different languages and communities, you know, that guy was summarizing that perhaps there is something that we need to be prepared for as a society, and you know, that's right in alignment. So we are going to get the next part of the presentation. We're going to have a panel. So joining us on the panel, Kenny, if you can take care of the video stuff here. So we're going to welcome Chris and Stephanie back onto the panel. But we also have some giants of the local community here. We have Dr. Akil Palanisamy is in the house, right over here. Dr. Akil Palanisamy is an integrative medicine specialist here with UCSF and Sutter Health, and he had a book called The Paleo Diet, which is super interesting, you know, modulating the paleo diet based on Vedic, the Vedic types. We have Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's in the house here from the Buck Institute, a leader in the field of Alzheimer's, and so we'll have a big round of applause for him. And then we have also Dr. Shave Kapadia here from IGBO. He's the Chief Medical Officer of IGBO and a cardiologist. He's going to be on the panel, so get ready with your questions. We do have some that have come in from Twitter, so I'll try to make sure that we hear everyone. And, you know, I do like to have my music play, so I'm going to just see if we can make that happen, because that's pretty much all I do in this thing here. All right, so yeah, let's get there. Come on in, come on over, gents and ladies. All right, this one on. Sorry. Dr. Bredesen, I'm going to start with you here. I know, I listened to your grand rounds at the Cleveland Clinic the other day. It was awesome, super interesting. You talk about there being different types of Alzheimer's, and I'd love to just jump into that because we're talking about individualized medicine. What are the different types of Alzheimer's, and how do you treat those different types differently?
We just saw a beautiful example.
It's up, it's on. Just try again.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So we just saw a beautiful example of looking carefully at many different metabolic parameters. And what we find is that if you actually look at people who have cognitive decline, be it full-blown Alzheimer's, pre-Alzheimer's, which is mild cognitive impairment, or pre-MCI, which is SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, what you see is that these people actually very clearly fall into different groups. And so we published this a few months ago and called this type 1, type 2, type 3, and then now there's all of type 4 and 5. And you can see, if you look at why organisms actually make amyloid, and you see Alzheimer's really as a change in a plasticity balance. Organisms make amyloid for 3 reasons. They make it because there is ongoing inflammation or infection, and of course amyloid is quite a good antimicrobial and an endogenous antibiofilm that binds metals and kills microbes. They also make it because of trophic factor withdrawal. So if you withdraw NGF or BDNF or estradiol, on and on and on, many supportive factors, the response is a downsizing that is led by the production of amyloid. And the third thing is that amyloid is quite good at binding a number of toxins, starting with divalent metals like mercury, copper, but also things like mycotoxins. So organisms make amyloids for different reasons, and we find that when you look at these more extensive profiles than are typically being done in doctors' offices, when dementia is being evaluated, you can see who is actually a type 1 or a type 2. Are people making this because of an inflammatory process? Interestingly, one of the common ones we call glycotoxic, which is actually type 1.5. These are people who typically have high hemoglobin A1Cs, high insulin resistance, that sort of thing. And it's because they have a combination of type 1. They have the inflammatory part from the advanced glycation end products, but they also have the atrophic part, which is from the insulin resistance. So insulin is a critical factor to support neuronal survival. So you can then look at these and treat them better. It turns out that you have to treat them differently. And specifically, type 3 is very different than the others because these people typically do have exposure to things like mycotoxins, high mercury, things like that, and you need to get at that instead of just giving them a drug for Alzheimer's disease.
That's super interesting. Doctor, maybe you could pass the mic to Dr. Palanisamy here. Doc, you're involved, everyone here is basically involved in completely individualized medicine, which is really exciting. Why paleo and why Vedic types within paleo?
Yeah, thanks, James. So I think for me, customizing a diet and lifestyle program is really the foundation of my practice. And Ayurveda and functional medicine, I think, share a lot in common. Some say that Ayurveda is the original functional medicine because, looking at the root cause and believing that all disease starts in the gut. So in terms of a paleo diet, I think removing all the foods that are inflammatory and really focusing on nutrient-dense healing foods, fermented foods. I've seen so many advantages with that in my patients, but they often have a challenge really figuring out what's the optimal diet for them. And that's where Ayurveda has been really helpful because it believes that every person has a unique body type from birth, and based on that, there's different dietary recommendations that go along with that. So it just helps taking paleo to the next level in terms of really personalizing it. You can tell someone to try and eat what's best for you and what's optimal, but most people need more advice and guidance for that, and that's where I found Ayurveda to be really helpful. So I think there's a real synergy between the two.
Doc, Doc, can I just stay here? Because one of the things that you guys are doing here at IGBOs is really democratizing access to personalized medicine by making that easy. And Steph's case was awesome there, right? All the regular labs show everything's normal, and then you go a little bit deeper into the other labs. Why have you sort of given up being a cardiologist to make IGBO, to take this role with IGBO? And what do you think the potential is with IGBO to create personalized medicine for everyone?
Fantastic. So I actually haven't given up practicing yet. I'm trying to evolve into the digital doc. And my heart's really been, no pun intended, in really early detection and prevention. And so using labs are really critical, along with listening, to really diagnosing diseases before they're even diseases, to change behavior, not necessarily starting medication. So the passion that really fueled this was that access to all this great science was really hampered by our ineffective blood logistics system that we have now, which is conventional phlebotomy. So if you think about it, there are over 3,000 specialty labs. We've got the reference labs out there. But how do these specialty labs get access to you guys and vice versa? And so as is science, James, you mentioned the convergence. I call it a super convergence where, you've got technology, you've got mobile. Everyone has an iPhone. More people have smartphones, and probably access to bathrooms or water. You've got connectivity. You've got data analytics. And then on the science side, you have this amazing transformation occurring where the costs of doing certain kind of lab tests, genetics, are exponentially going down. So you get this super convergence occurring where the time is just right to disrupt our blood logistics system, because all of you guys, I'm sure the experience of ordering lab tests for your patients can be challenging. You give them a lab slip, James said 60 to 70% of the time they get it, they get the blood work done, but then what about those that don't get it? How do you know that they haven't gotten it done? And for me, it's a daily chore to try to understand that, because 70 to 80% of your medical decisions are often driven by a drop of blood, along with the history taking and everything else that you do. So we really sought out to try to disrupt this part of the healthcare system where we could democratize access by creating a platform. And so Uber paved the path for us ahead of time, creating that on-demand type of service. And we thought, what if we could create that for providers, create an on-demand blood delivery system, so that when you order a lab, any kind of lab, that our Iggies could go get that lab work, whether it's in the office, like now, or it's tomorrow or next week or 3 months from now at work or at home or wherever the patient is. So on demand, anytime, anywhere, conveniently, and in a compliant type of way. Because remember, we want to make sure that they get the blood drawn. So that was really the basis of the fundamental reason we started this.
So you could book someone now and then book someone again in a month and 3 months, depending on when you need them to be drawn again?
Exactly. So you can create packages, right? So if you have certain panels, if it's diabetes and you need to monitor A1C or what other, you can do it every 3 months and again and again and again. And the other, vision that we have is creating playlists for our providers so that they can tap into this great science and say, listen, I can create a panel for this symptom. I'm feeling tired. I have a fatigue package, the hair loss package, or disease packages. So if you think about Apple Music or Spotify, you start to think about what the possibilities are that IGBO can clearly curate all this great science and then provide that decision support at a stroke of a pen or at a click of a mouse for you guys.
You're making my job harder, because I've already got you pegged as the Uber for phlebotomists. You can't be the Spotify for phlebotomists too. Dr. Bredesen, what's really cool with the Functional Forum is that it's Tuesday lunchtime in Australia and people are watching and sending in questions. So welcome everyone who it's Tuesday. Dr. Bredesen, someone has asked from Australia, they watch your Grand Rounds as well, and they were asking what your thoughts were about Alzheimer's in the context of this evolutionary medicine that we've been talking about today. Is there any understanding of Alzheimer's in that context?
Absolutely. I think in multiple ways to think about evolutionary medicine. One of the things we just published recently was a new insight into what ApoE actually does. And as you know, some people have called ApoE the God gene because it was involved with our evolution. It was involved with our coming down out of the trees, becoming hominids from simians. And it turns out to have effects, as we've heard, for carrying lipid, for binding to multiple receptors. Now, if you've just seen, actually, it just came out in Cell. It's also turning out to be important for invasion and metastasis of tumors, and of course, cardiovascular disease, and of course, it's the most important genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And what we found is that it actually is surprisingly a transcription factor. So it actually enters the nucleus. We found that it binds to the promoters of 1,700 different genes, and it literally changes the programmatics of the cell, changing, again, a little bit like what we heard about with thyroid. So you're changing from a state in which sirtuin, SIRT1 is dominant, in which it's a metabolic state and it is a non-inflammatory state, more toward an NF-kappa B dominated state. And these two are actually mutually antagonistic. So you're now changing the state of the cell toward more of an NF-kappa B-like cell. And of course, so part of our getting Alzheimer's disease, it's such a common problem now, and if you look at the 318 million Americans, 45 million of us will get this during our lifetimes if we don't do something about it. You're really talking, for many people, about a mismatch between evolution and between the way we are currently living, absolutely. And of course, that tells you a little bit about how to treat it.
Chris, I know you see a lot of very tough patients in your clinic. Do you see Alzheimer's, and do you have some concordance there with Dr. Bredesen's thoughts?
We don't treat a lot of Alzheimer's in the clinic, but we see earlier stage dementia and cognitive issues. And I would just equate, there's really no modern disease that I'm aware of that doesn't have this element of mismatch at the core. If you look at traditional populations, contemporary hunter-gatherers, they died because of trauma or lack of emergency medical care, of high rates of infant mortality. And so their average lifespans were shorter for those reasons, but they didn't get chronic disease, typically. Chronic disease is actually a modern problem. There just wasn't a lot of chronic disease in traditional populations, and people have argued that that's because they didn't live long enough to get it. But there have been anthropological studies that have found that when contemporary hunter-gatherer populations had access to even the most rudimentary emergency medical care, they lived lifespans that were equivalent largely to our modern lifespans, but the difference is they reach those ages without acquiring Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease or any of these other modern problems. So I would argue that there is really no modern disease that isn't primarily driven by this mismatch.
Akil, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to add to the NF-kappa B, there's some really fascinating research about the effect of spices on that, on activating that transcription factor. So, that's a huge part of Ayurveda, and I'm sure everybody here knows about turmeric, but also, a lot of other spices that are commonly used, like allspice, clove, ginger, cinnamon, fenugreek. These have all been shown to promote NF-kappa B activity, and speaking of Alzheimer's, India has one of the lowest rates, in the world, and I think partly is maybe due to dietary factors and the use of spices and turmeric, and I think these are simple suggestions that we can give our patients, because no matter what kind of diet somebody's following, they can incorporate spices. Spices are the second most nutrient-dense type of food that's out there after organ meats. So in addition to nutrient density and antioxidant capacity, anti-inflammatory effects, and positive gene modulation, spices also help digestion, and they can help your food taste better. So I think there's really a win-win situation using spices.
Awesome. Steph, we're having some great feedback on your talk here on Twitter. It's always fun to watch this as it's happening. People are wondering sort of, what are some of the common things? Was that case that you saw common? And what are some other things that you're doing regularly to induce, say, pregnancy and help in that part when the lab tests are showing normal?
Yeah, I think the perspective to keep in mind when you're looking at cases like that is that there's a subclinical communication to our biological system that's saying this is not a good time, this is not a great opportunity. And as opposed to looking at even relatively subnormal levels from a functional medicine perspective and trying to treat it directly with thyroid hormone medication, the idea would be instead is to look at all the reasons why the biological system is getting that message and try to undo each of those factors.
Can I follow up that with a question? I know
Yeah.
last month we had Dr. Kelly Brogan, and she said, as she's gone through her practice, it started off in integrative medicine with lots of labs and lots of supplements, trying to do a lot of stuff to patients. But then as she became a little bit more, as she went through it, she'd find that it was really about getting to patients and say, hey, what's happening in your life here now? Like, what is really going on? Like, what does the next stage of your life look like? And that was such a powerful lever to really like see significant change. I just wonder like your thoughts on that, because I know you've sort of become known as a hormone and birth specialist in that way.
Yeah.
It seems like having a child is a pretty big moment, and I wonder, I just thought in the context of your conversations there, I just thought I'd love to hear you comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think similar to Kelly, my practice is evolving in that way too. Where I see functional medicine more as a bridge for bringing people to this kind of perspective in order to give them a broader view or a macro level view of really what's going on in their life. How are they eating? What are their relationships like? What are they thinking about? What are they afraid of? And I think it plays a huge role to look at the 12-foot view rather than the nitty-gritty micro details of the numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited to have tonight here on the stage Dr. Bredesen, Dr. Kresser, Dan Kalish is in the house. I spoke about this big convergence of doctors who are really bringing the brand of functional medicine forward and getting it out there and coming up with their own programs. Dr. Kapadia, you spoke about like creating these playlists. It seems like if there are doctors out there that are bringing sort of tribes of doctors through into this new paradigm, that having like a playlist of like best of labs and supplements and structures, there's going to be some sort of need to support that the reproducibility of, say, Chris's work to tens of thousands of other doctors. And how do you think IGBO can play a role in that?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm really inspired by the work that you all are doing, because it really gets to the root cause. And as a practicing doc on the other side in traditional healthcare, I'm not seeing that happen. It's wait until it's broken, then go to the most expensive resource and get it fixed, and that's what I see over and over again. So it's refreshing. And so my goal at IGBO, and I want to shout out to Andy Grayson, our Chief Communications Officer here, and Ann McLean, who's our provider sales support, but is to really enable you guys to do the great work, all of you guys do the great work that you're doing every day, and not worry about the logistics of the blood tests that desperately need to be done. It sounds very much that lab testing appropriately can diagnose conditions that can be treated very, very early on before they become quote unquote diseases. So our idea is really to take the insights from all that you're all doing, and hopefully we'll do some of that tonight, and really start to build that framework where we can pull all this amazing science. There are certain laboratory companies that probably all use, but there's so much more that's out there that we could tap into. And so that's going to take a little bit of time, but also, as we start to learn how you practice, what you're looking for, we can start to build the compendium of amazing labs out there, reference labs, hormone testing, metal testing, nutritional type of deficiencies, and then looking at genetics and genomics and putting that all together to say what would a baseline panel for a certain digestive problem look like, or what would it look like for a baseline for a cognitive dysfunction Alzheimer's type patient, and then what would be the follow-up testing that would be required to test the effects of whether it's lifestyle behavior changes or supplements or nutritional changes in that kind of follow-up, and being able to hardwire that in some packages we've discussed before.
These guys are ready to learn, and they're ready to learn from all of you. So I would encourage you, if you have ideas about packages or different combinations of labs, find Dr. Kapadia, find these other people afterwards. We are going to have time for a few questions from the audience, but I would just remind you that if you want to be on the Functional Forum sometime, come and speak to me and we'll speak. This is not your moment to be on the Functional Forum. We got an awesome panel here. And you know how that's like at conferences, right? You know how that goes. We don't have time for that sort of nonsense, but we will take some questions from the panel. Let's go down right here. All right.
Thank you. Awesome, you guys. Thank you. If I was going to get a lab done as an everyday person and I want to look at amyloid plaque or C-reactive protein, where do I start on the first couple layers of labs that the everyday person could maybe afford and should know their numbers?
Steph and Chris, you guys are the most generalists, I would say. Why don't you jump in there? What are the most common ones you guys are using?
So I have a case review blood panel that I do with every patient that comes into my practice, and it it is a fine line between doing everything you could possibly imagine doing and patients spending thousands of dollars, and then doing not enough where you don't get the information you need. So I'm always actually kind of tweaking that. But I look at blood sugar, fasting glucose, and hemoglobin A1C. I have patient do some post-meal blood sugar testing with the glucometer to see what their reaction to their carbohydrate tolerance. We do a comprehensive metabolic panel. We do a full thyroid panel. We do a CB. Are you a clinician? Okay. So yeah, we complete blood count. So we look at white blood cells and red blood cells. Can give us some information about your immune function. Nutrients like vitamin D and vitamin B12, which are really cornerstone nutrients. A full iron panel. Because iron deficiency, very common problem, but iron overload is also a problem with cognitive disorders. I'm just going by memory here, down my entire panel. Magnesium, uric acid, which can be important for blood sugar disorders, and of course a lipid panel. That's kind of the basics of it, and you can get all of that for if you have insurance. We'll often cover it entirely, or if you're paying out of pocket, it's about $180 the way we do it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a Kresser panel in the works for sure. Steph?
I would add to that because I see a lot of women, hormones. I add hormones, but everything that Chris is looking at, I'm also looking at in addition to the hormonal factors.
Absolutely. All right, one more question here.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you guys talk about hyperthyroid, hyperthyroidism and what that means from a functional evolutionary perspective?
I'll be curious to hear what you have to say, but I don't know that it's, hyperthyroidism is typically autoimmune. So what I would say about that is, from an evolutionary perspective, again, autoimmune diseases were quite rare until really recently, and they're still quite rare in the developing world. If you're familiar with the hygiene hypothesis or the old friends hypothesis, one theory is that our over-sanitized environment has reduced our exposure to organisms that we co-evolved with and had kind of a tuning effect on our immune system. And so any condition that involves an autoimmune element like hyperthyroidism, typically Graves' disease is the primary cause of hyperthyroidism, could be looked at as an expression of mismatch with our modern environment.
I think I would agree. It's just another dysregulated response by the body to environmental inputs that are not meant to be experienced, essentially. So,
Dr. Bredesen, maybe I could have you have the final word here on the panel. I know one of the things that is very exciting about your work is that Alzheimer's has certainly been something that there's no treatment for, and no conventional treatment for, and some of the results that you've had coming from your practice has been really powerful. Just to speak to the sort of the potential of this convergence, right? You've got Chris who's doing very deep, very sick patients, doing a lot of labs, working these things at a deep level. You also have this sort of, the old school naturopathic therapeutic order, right? Where you can start, if you can placebo yourself well, then you should probably do that. And if that doesn't work, maybe a bit of diet and lifestyle and then supplements. And then, we've got the whole therapeutic order upside down with, doing so many of the drugs. What do you see from your corner of the globe where you're seeing, tough people with no conventional treatments? What is the promise of this integrative lifestyle, functional, evolutionary medicine to make an impact on non-communicable disease?
And I should say we came from completely the other way. We came out of the test tube, and the surprise about 5-6 years ago has been that when you look at the mechanisms driving this underlying process, it fits into the functional medicine model just beautifully. You couldn't ask for a better fit. So in fact, if you look at this huge problem, we're talking about out of the 318 million Americans, 75 million who are ApoE4 heterozygotes, 7 million who are homozygotes. If you are homozygous, you have about a 90% chance of developing Alzheimer's, about 30% if you're heterozygous, and about 9% if you have 0 copies of ApoE4. So it's a huge issue. And in fact, just as you said, this is being driven largely by glycotoxicity, by essentially the way we are living. And interestingly, many of the panels we see look very much like what Dr. Daniel showed us a few minutes ago. They typically are hypothyroid. They typically have a slightly high TSH. So absolutely, the first thing starts with diet, exercise, stress, and sleep. And the surprise is how large of an effect that makes and how large of a negative effect that makes with sedentary lifestyles, high stress. So I have a chapter in a book coming up which looks at how do you give if you wanted to give yourself Alzheimer's, which presumably you wouldn't, but if you want, it's an instructive thing to think about. How would you do it? And in fact, you would basically do what we're all doing in our lifestyles. You'd have a high stress, you'd be eating all sorts of meat, you'd have a lousy diet, you'd be eating a lot of sugar and processed foods, the same foods we saw just a few minutes ago. You'd be doing many of the things that our society drives us to do. So you're absolutely right. That is the first way to go. It is a mismatch, as Chris was saying earlier. And then from there, you can go through the herbs. We have an Ayurvedic physician in the laboratory. We use very much that approach. We typically do use ashwagandha, which interestingly increases the removal of amyloid. Bacopa, very common thing to use. Curcumin, very common as well. And you just go down those. And obviously, the idea is that drugs are the dessert. Drugs are not the entree. Drugs are the dessert. So there is a place for drugs. We typically tell the patients 36 holes in the roof, a drug will help with one hole very well, but it's only one hole. You got to get the other 35 holes, and that's where functional medicine comes in.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. A big round of applause for the panel here. So, thanks so much again for being out here, 4 o'clock on a Monday. I really appreciate everyone making the time to be here. Please, if you're watching at home or if you're in different areas, meetup.functionalforum.com. We're going to have a bunch of meetups in the San Francisco area. We're going to come here, do this event. I hope that we'll have one in Marin and East Bay and San Francisco. And Frank's got his down in Burlingame. We're going to, we're going to cover every zip code in America. That's the goal. We have some amazing functional forums coming up. So get your group together for these forums coming up. Next Monday, the 2nd of May, we have a recap episode from Integrated Health Symposium. We have Dr. David Perlmutter. We have Dr. Daniel Kraft, and we have some amazing information on community medicine. We're going to be talking about the power of grouping, not only grouping patients together, but grouping symptoms together, and to be able to deliver much better medicine. Monday, June the 6th, live from the Royal Society of Medicine in London with Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, who I know you know, Dr. Bredesen, because last time I was in San Francisco, he was coming to learn what you do. Dr. Michael Ash, that's going to be from London, Monday, 6th of June. And then Monday, September the 12th, we're coming live from the Cleveland Clinic. Seth Godin says the easiest thing to do is to react, the second hardest thing to do is respond, and the hardest thing to do is initiate. And I'm asking our community to initiate locally. Get your groups of practitioners together. Create a safe space where Western doctors can come in, listen to this type of information. That's going to be what's required to take this to the next level. And then we'll get to November the 7th and we'll have a massive connection just before the election. We'll see, that could be quite fun too. So this has been the Functional Forum. Very happy for you all to be here. Thanks so much for being here, and good night.